Welcome back to the Book Nook podcast. We're finally here, ready for our deep dive into Stephen Fry's Odyssey. You know, the one that wraps up his whole Greek mythology series.
It's the perfect way to round things out.
Yeah, and to make this deep dive extra special, we've got like a whole mountain of reviews and interviews, even some juicy comments from Goodreads.
Sounds like we're in for a treat.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know me, I just love hearing what other people thought, you know.
Absolutely. It gives you a different perspective.
It does, it really does. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do these deep dives, right?
For sure. To get a richer understanding.
Exactly. We want to look at a book from all angles, not just our own. And speaking of different perspectives, I'm so curious to hear what you thought of Fry's Odyssey, especially because it doesn't just retell Odysseus's journey, right? It weaves in all these other heroes' homecomings too.
Yeah, it's almost like he's giving us this panoramic view of life after the Trojan War.
Yeah, it's like a big tapestry. And he does it with his signature wit, you know. Like there's this one part where he describes Agamemnon stumbling home from Troy, and he compares him to, get this, a tipsy golfer.
Oh, I remember that. It's classic Fry. He always finds these unexpected ways to make you laugh.
He really does. And that's what makes him so engaging, right?
Totally. He manages to balance that humor with the gravitas of the story. Just like the original epics did, actually.
Oh, good point. I never thought of it that way.
The ancient Greeks weren't afraid to mix humor and tragedy, and Fry captures that same spirit.
He does. He really does. And he makes it all so relatable, too. Like, he'll drop in these brilliant modern references. At one point, he even compares Odysseus to a surfer.
It's those little touches that make it feel like Fry's having a conversation with the reader.
Yes, exactly. It's like he's saying, hey, these ancient stories, they're not so different from our lives today.
Exactly. He's bridging the gap between ancient Greece and the modern world.
It's brilliant. And speaking of bridges, let's talk about how he connects Odysseus's journey to this broader theme of Nostos.
Ah, yes, the concept of homecoming.
Right. And it's not just Odysseus's homecoming he explores, right? He brings in other Greek heroes like Ajax and Menelaus.
He does. It's actually a very authentic approach. You see, in ancient Greece, there were tons of these return poems, each one dedicated to a different hero.
Wow, I had no idea. So the Odyssey is just the only one that survived completely.
That's right. So in a way, Fry is kind of reconstructing this lost literary tradition, which I think is pretty cool.
It is. It's like he's giving us a glimpse into a whole world of stories that we might never have known about otherwise. And speaking of glimpses, there's this one review, I think it was from Barking at the Moon, where they describe Odysseus' longing for home as a yearning for fish fingers in The Simpsons.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's such a quirky way to capture that deep nostalgia, that nostos that we're talking about.
It is, and it's so relatable, right? Like, who hasn't felt that longing for the simple comforts of home?
Exactly. Fry has this incredible knack for taking these big epic themes and grounding them in those everyday human experiences.
He does. And before we get too deep into those themes, let me just take a quick moment to remind everyone to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review.
Yes, please do. We love hearing from you, and it really helps other bookworms discover the show.
It keeps these deep dives going. All right, back to the Odyssey. One thing that really stood out to me was how Fry portrays Odysseus. You know, he really emphasizes his cunning and cleverness.
He does, and it kind of challenges that classic image of the brute force hero, doesn't it?
It does. It's like Fry is saying, hey, there's more to heroism than just physical strength.
Exactly. Odysseus uses his mind as his weapon, and Fry really highlights that.
He does. Now, I'm curious about how he handles Penelope. She plays such a crucial role in the original Odyssey. What's Fry's take on her character?
That's where things get interesting. Some sources, like this pasted text we have here, point out that there are some pretty big differences between Fry's adaptation and Homer's.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for example, he kind of downplays Telemachus's actions and changes how Penelope's role in the archery contest unfolds.
Interesting. So some critics feel like he maybe strays a bit too far from the source material.
That seems to be the case. It's a common debate when it comes to adaptations, right? How much creative liberty can an author take while still honoring the original?
Absolutely. And that's something we'll definitely want to unpack further as we go along.
We will. It's a complex issue.
It is. But, you know, even with those criticisms, it seems like most reviewers agree that Fry delivers a story that's engaging and enjoyable.
He does. Even the folks who had reservations about his adaptation, they still praised his ability to make these ancient stories accessible to modern readers.
He really has a knack for that. He takes these potentially intimidating myths and makes them fun and relatable.
Exactly. He doesn't shy away from the humor or the humanity of these stories.
And let's not forget the praise for his audiobook narration. I saw a Goodreads review where someone said his voice was like a drug, addictive in a good way.
Haha, that sounds about right.
Right. He definitely has a way with words.
He does. And I think that's part of what makes his Odyssey so compelling. It's not just a retelling, it's an interpretation.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so ripe for discussion, right?
Absolutely. There's so much to unpack and explore.
Well, before we dive into all that, let me just remind everyone once again to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review.
Your support means the world to us.
It does. It really helps us keep these deep dives going.
And speaking of deep dives, we've got a lot more to discuss about Stephen Fry's Odyssey, so stay tuned.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Just kidding. We don't have any sponsors. We're just two bookworms who love talking about books. So let's jump right back in. One of the things I wanted to touch on was how Fry portrays the female characters, especially Penelope.
Yes, that's an important point. And it's an area where Fry's adaptation has received some criticism.
Right. And I'm thinking specifically about the points raised in the pasted text source, about how Fry handles Penelope's role and the omission of Telemachus's actions toward the maidservants.
Yes, those are significant points to consider. The author of that piece argues that Fry's portrayal of Penelope is more passive compared to the original. And by excluding the hanging of the maidservants, he creates a more romanticized version of the Odyssey.
Okay, so essentially the argument is that he's sanitizing the story a bit, right?
Yes, that's one way to look at it. And it raises important questions about how we, as modern readers, approach these ancient texts. How do we deal with the ethical complexities and potentially problematic aspects of these stories through a modern lens?
That's such a great question, and it's not one with an easy answer. It's this constant balancing act, isn't it? We want to appreciate these classic works for their literary value and historical significance, but we also have to grapple with the fact that our values and sensibilities have evolved over time.
Exactly. It's not about erasing or ignoring those challenging aspects, but engaging with them thoughtfully and critically.
It's a conversation that goes way beyond Fry's Odyssey. It's relevant to any time we're dealing with classic literature. These stories are not static artifacts. They're living texts that can be interpreted and reinterpreted in countless ways.
And that's what makes these discussions so fascinating. Each new retelling, each adaptation, adds another layer of meaning to the original.
It's like this ongoing dialogue across time and perspectives. And ultimately, it's up to each individual reader to decide how they want to engage with these stories, to wrestle with those ethical questions, and to draw their own conclusions.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of literature. It sparks critical thinking, encourages us to question our assumptions, and invites us to consider a multitude of viewpoints.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do here at the Book Nook podcast, right?
Spot on.
We want to create a space where we can explore these complex ideas, share our passion for books, and hopefully inspire our listeners to embark on their own literary adventures.
Speaking of adventures, I think we have a few more thoughts to share about Fry's Odyssey. But first, let's remind our listeners.
Oh, yes. Please, please, please subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave a review if you enjoy these deep dives. It really helps us out, and it helps other bookworms discover the show. All right, back to the Odyssey. One of the things that struck me about Fry's take is how he structures the narrative. He seems to focus primarily on the moment of Odysseus' return, on that resolution and homecoming.
That's an interesting observation. He doesn't dwell too much on the trials and tribulations leading up to that moment, does he?
No, not really. He touches on them, of course, but the emphasis is definitely on that final homecoming.
I see it as a deliberate choice on Fry's part. He could have easily lingered on the violence, the betrayals, the darker aspects of Odysseus' journey. But instead, he chooses to offer a sense of hope, a feeling that even after the most difficult journeys, peace and belonging are possible.
That's a really beautiful way to put it, and it ties back so perfectly to that central theme of Nostos, that longing for home that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Fry seems to be suggesting that home isn't just a physical destination, but a state of being, a sense of wholeness and connection that we all strive for.
And Odysseus' journey, both literally and metaphorically, is about finding his way back to that wholeness. It's a really powerful message, and it makes you think about the Odyssey in a new light.
It does. Despite all the challenges, the missteps, the moral ambiguities, Odysseus ultimately finds his way back to that sense of belonging. And it speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, our capacity for growth and transformation.
It's a message that resonates so deeply, even for those of us who haven't had to face literal cyclops or sirens in our lives. It reminds us that even when we stray from our past, even when we make mistakes, there's always a possibility of redemption, of finding our way back to where we truly belong.
And Fry manages to convey that message with such optimism and grace. He doesn't sugarcoat the challenges, but he also doesn't leave us wallowing in despair.
It's a beautiful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, always a reason to keep striving for that sense of homecoming. Whether it's a return to a physical place, a reconciliation with loved ones, or simply a reconnection with our own true selves.
And Fry's Odyssey, with its blend of wit, wisdom, and heartfelt storytelling, serves as a brilliant guide on that journey.
Well said.
All right, so picking up where we left off with Stephen Fry's Odyssey, we were talking about some readers finding it a little weaker than his other mythology books.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that. Like, what did the reviews specifically say?
One thing that kept popping up was Fry's handling of certain characters and some specific plot points. For example, the pasted text we have argues that Fry really downplays Telemachus and kind of changes Penelope's role in the archery contest.
So, like, making it a little different from the original.
Yeah, they felt like Fry's version was a bit more simplified, maybe even a little romanticized.
Oh, interesting. So some critics felt like he strayed a bit too far from the source.
Yeah, it seems like it's always a tricky thing with adaptations, right? Balancing staying true to the original and making it your own.
Totally. But even with those criticisms, it sounds like most people still found Fry's Odyssey engaging.
Oh, absolutely. Even the folks who had issues with the adaptation, they still loved Fry's writing style. And they all agreed that he made these ancient stories super accessible.
He does have a way of doing that, taking these myths and making them feel relevant today.
Right. He doesn't shy away from the humor or the human side of it all.
And the independent review we have mentions that Fry includes the trial of Orestes. They highlight that scene as being really significant.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have to admit, I'm not totally sure why it's so important. Could you maybe refresh my memory?
Sure. So basically, in Fry's interpretation, the Orestes trial represents this shift from the old way of doing things with divine intervention and blood feuds to a newer way, more focused on human justice and reason.
Ah, okay. I see the connection now. It ties into that whole theme of humanity kind of moving on from the age of gods and taking responsibility for its own fate.
Exactly. And it's a theme that still resonates today, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It makes you think about our own systems of justice,
Yeah.
right? And the role of reason in our world.
It's amazing how these ancient stories can still feel so relevant.
They really can. It's like they give us this lens to examine our own values and beliefs, and maybe even challenge them a little bit.
Exactly. They offer both escapism and a chance for some serious self-reflection.
And with Fry as our guide, it's a journey full of laughter, insight, and renewed appreciation for the power of storytelling.
Well said.
So what about you? Was there anything specific about Fry's Odyssey that resonated with you?
You know, one thing that really struck me was how he explored the idea of nostos, that longing for home. I keep thinking about that quote from the Barking at the Moon review, where they described Odysseus missing those simple comforts of home, like fish fingers and The Simpsons.
Oh yeah, I love that. It was such a perfect way to capture that feeling.
It really was, and Fry doesn't shy away from the complex emotions that come with that longing. The pain of separation, the challenges of going back, that bittersweet realization that sometimes going home isn't as easy as it seems.
It makes you think about home as more than just a place. It's like a state of mind, a feeling of connection and belonging.
I love that. And you're right. Odysseus' journey, both physically and metaphorically, is all about him finding his way back to that wholeness.
It's a journey we can all relate to, I think.
For sure. And I think Fry's Odyssey, with its mix of humor, sadness, and thought-provoking ideas, offers a really interesting take on that universal experience.
Definitely. Okay, before we move on, let's take a moment to remind our listeners to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast.
And leave us a review if you're enjoying the deep dive. Your support keeps these conversations going.
It does. Now, I'd love to hear more about Fry's portrayal of the female characters, especially Penelope. There seems to be some debate around that.
Yeah, that's where some of the more critical perspectives come in.
You're talking about the pasted text source again? The one about how Fry changes Penelope's role and leaves out what happens to the maidservants?
Exactly. That author really felt like Fry presented a more passive Penelope and argued that by not including the part about the maids, he kind of creates a more sanitized and romanticized version.
Right. That raises some big questions about how we approach these ancient texts today. How do we balance staying true to the original with our modern values?
It's tricky. We want to enjoy these classics, but also acknowledge that things have changed. Our ideas about certain things are different now. It's about finding a way to engage with those potentially problematic parts, not just ignoring them.
It's a conversation that goes beyond just Fry's Odyssey, doesn't it? It applies to any time we're dealing with older literature. These books are more than just static things on a shelf. They're alive, and they can be interpreted in so many different ways.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these discussions so interesting. Every retelling, every new perspective adds another layer to the original story.
It's like a conversation across time. And it's up to each reader to decide how they want to engage with that conversation,
Yeah.
to wrestle with the ethical stuff and figure out what it all means to them.
I love that. That's what literature is all about, getting us thinking, questioning our assumptions, and considering all these different viewpoints.
And that's what we're all about here at the Book Nook Podcast. Creating a space where we can explore these ideas, share our love of books, and hopefully inspire our listeners to go on their own literary adventures.
And speaking of adventures, we've got a few more thoughts to share about Fry's Odyssey, so stay with us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with Fry's Odyssey. The humor, the modern references, how he portrays the characters. We even talked about some of the criticisms.
Right, right. But there's one more thing I wanted to bring up. It's about how Fry structures the whole story and where he chooses to end it.
Interesting. Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all those individual episodes, the different adventures Odysseus has. But the way Fry frames the whole narrative definitely influences how we understand everything.
Exactly. And I noticed that Fry really focuses on the moment when Odysseus finally gets back home. That sense of resolution, of homecoming. He doesn't really dwell on all the tough stuff leading up to it. It's true. He could have spent way more time on the violence, the betrayal, all the dark things Odysseus goes through. But instead, Fry kind of gives us this glimmer of hope. Like even after the hardest journeys, you can still find peace and belonging.
And it circles back so beautifully to that idea of nostos, right? That longing for home. It's like Fry saying home isn't just a place. It's more like a feeling, a sense of wholeness, something we all search for.
That's a really powerful message. It makes you rethink Odysseus' journey. Like, yeah, he messed up, made bad choices, but he still managed to find his way back to where he belonged. It shows how resilient people can be, how we can grow and change.
It's a message that speaks to everyone, even if we haven't literally fought Cyclops or been tempted by sirens. It's that reminder that even when we screw up, there's still hope. We can find our way back, whether it's to an actual place or just to our true selves.
And Fry does a fantastic job of getting that message across with this sense of optimism and grace. It's not like he ignores the bad stuff, but he doesn't leave you feeling depressed either.
It's like he's saying, hey, even when things are tough, there's always a reason to keep going, to keep searching for that feeling of homecoming.
And Fry's Odyssey, with all its wit and wisdom and heart, it's like this amazing guidebook for that journey.
I love that. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Stephen Fry's Odyssey.
This has been such a fun conversation.
It really has. And before we go, we want to remind you, dear listeners, to subscribe to the Book Nook podcast and leave us a review. We really appreciate your support.
And be sure to check the show notes. We'll have links to all the sources we talked about, plus a link where you can get your own copy of Fry's Odyssey.
Thank you so much for joining us on this literary adventure. Until next time, happy reading.
And happy adventuring!